My name is Tanzina Vega, and I'm the Race and Inequality reporter for CNN and CNN Money. I want to just quickly introduce the panelists today that we'll be hearing from, and then we'll open it up for two presentations about the report that the EPI is releasing, and then we'll open that up. Valerie Wilson is the director of the program on race, ethnicity, and the economy here at the EPI. Next to Valerie is Bill Rodgers, a Rutgers University professor of public policy, Roosevelt Institute, and a member of the Black Lives Matter economic policy team. And last but not least, Richard Freeman is an economist and a professor at Harvard University.
We'll jump right into things. Hear more about the report and hopefully engage in a lively and interesting conversation about this research on black-white wage gaps. So by now, assume that the black-white wage gap is larger now than it was in 1979. But I think it's also important to understand the context of this expansion and to understand that this expansion has not occurred in a vacuum. Growing economic inequality and near stagnation of hourly wage growth for the vast majority of American workers. So one way of illustrating this is to compare the potential for pay increases with median wage growth. So, first line I have up here is the line for productivity growth. We see that there's been, pretty good, pretty decent, strong productivity growth over the period that we are studying. But when we begin to look at how wages have grown for different segments of the population, for white men, there's actually been, and this is median wage growth, so people earn more than the folks that are represented in this graph. There's been a loss of about 3%. When we look at wage growth for white women, it's about half of what productivity has grown. So it's stronger wage growth than white men, but still well below productivity growth. When we add African Americans to this, we see again the negative, the losses among men. We see some positive growth again among African American women, but again, well below productivity. And for both African American men and women, wage growth is slower than their white counterparts, in which we look at these growing racial disparities in pay. And, a growing racial wage gap would be problematic at any time. But I think that under these conditions in particular, the costs are even greater because we're talking about losses in an expanding gap as opposed to a growing gap when everyone is moving up at a faster rate. The racial wage gap, so that relative difference in pay between blacks and whites, we spend a lot of time talking about how that has changed and why that has changed. But I also want a broader agenda and plan for economic justice. There are really two issues to address. One is this broader issue of wage stagnation, as well as address that have grown over time. And in a few moments, my co-author Bill Rodgers is going to talk some more about some of the recommendations for how we address each of those things. So the way the difference in average hourly wages of full-time black and white workers. So essentially our estimates are measuring how much higher white workers' wages are. It means that there's greater equity, a larger number means that there's less equity. And in order to isolate the racial component of this difference, we perform the analysis separately for men and for women. So we're comparing black men to white men, black women to white women to understand what's going on in terms of racial disparities. So these lines show the average racial wage gap among men, that's the blue line, and among women, which is the red line. Mean, these are averages. And these are what we call, I'm calling these unadjusted wage gaps, meaning they're just the population average. I take all full-time workers, the average for black workers, as for white workers, we compare them and we get these gaps. And I'll also show in a moment how race and gender intersect, but for now we're going to focus exclusively on just the racial differences. So again, this is a population average. We know that the composition of black workers in the labor force isn't identical. So there are differences in education, there are differences in years of experience, different populations are different parts of the country. I think about 60% of the African American workforce lives in the South. And then there are differences based on whether or not you live in a metropolitan area. So we control for all of these factors as well, and that's how we measure what we're calling an adjusted wage gap. So I will add those lines to the picture here. And so it's the lighter blue line for men and the brighter red line for women. We see that the size of the gap gets smaller, so sure, those differences account for, part of this overall observed average difference. But it's important to also know that those worker characteristics do not fully explain racial differences in pay. These lines didn't go to zero once we controlled for those factors. The key finding of the paper is that there is no, it's part of the motivation behind why we're looking at trends for men and women separately, as well as we look at different levels of education and within different regions of the country. So then that takes white women, black women, and black men relative all to white men. So we're going to put everyone now on the same graph and compare everyone to black men. I think there are a few points that I'd like to emphasize from this graph. One, we see that most of the pay disadvantage experienced by black women is a gender disadvantage. We saw that, if we look at the difference between these two lines, black women are the darker blue, white women are the lighter blue. The space between these two lines, at least in this earlier period, 79, early 80s, isn't that wide. That's just solely the racial component. The entire year, and you see these gaps are closer to 40%, around the 40% mark, that incorporates the gender disadvantage in pay. So more of the disadvantage in pay the African American face is a result of gender disparities than racial disparities. I think something else that pops out in this graph is that there was a period of sharp improvement in the gender gap. Again, as a smaller number in the measurement of these gaps is greater equity. So there was a period of sharp improvement in the gender disparity during the 1980s through about the mid-1990s, but about mid-1990s, that stopped. And when that stopped, that's when we begin to see the racial disparity among black women and white women growing or expanding. So throughout most of this, we see the gender disparity and the racial disparity essentially moving in opposite directions. The red line is black men relative to white men, and again, it's gradually increasing to you have here. One of our other findings, again in this story about there is no monolithic black experience, is that racial gaps have grown the most among the most highly educated. I think that's probably one of the more shocking findings in the report because there's this perception or idea that, education is the solution to everything. It definitely boosts wages, it increases wages for Black and for white workers, but by no means disparity in pay. This particular graph is for what we call new entrant men. So these are men with 0 to 10 years of work experience. But the pattern is similar for each of the other groups that we looked at as well. We also included more experienced workers, and we did this for men and for women as well. We get a similar pattern. In the early 80s, education were, close to parity, about 4%. If you had a bachelor's degree or more, that since has grown to closer to 18%. For workers with a high school diploma only, it was higher in 1980 and has stayed pretty much close to that as we've gone through time. So most of the expansion of racial wage gaps, or the largest expansions, have happened among the most highly educated. I think another interesting take or cut at the data shows what we've seen in terms of the size of the gap across different regions of the country. So again, starting in the early 80s, there were larger racial wage gaps in the South. I don't know that that would be surprising to anyone, that the gaps were large in the South 40 years ago. But I think what is interesting is that we've seen convergence in the size of these gaps over time. So in 1980, there were clear differences depending on where you lived in the country in terms of what size gap you were likely to experience, what size pay gap. But now we see that they're all clustered about around the same size, 22%. So what this says is that at some point, there was an opportunity to move or relocate, and increase your chances of having more pay equity. But since that time, that is not so much the case anymore. It really doesn't matter where you live in the country. The size of the gap is going to be about the same. Now, moving on to our next major finding, that is the expansion of these gaps has not been uniform across time. So we look at sort of the long-term trend. We see it's higher now than in '79. That hasn't been every period of time. So we identify at least 3 distinct period phases of the Black-white wage gap. And so in this graph, there are 2 things I want to point out. One are the distinct phases. We see, again, the entire length of these bars measures the change in the Black-white wage gap. So a positive number is an expansion of the gap. A negative number is a shrinking of the gap. So we see there's expansion during the 1980s, pretty significant expansion. We see a pretty good improvement in the late 1990s period here. And then we see another, pretty good size expansion in the years since 2007, or post-Great Recession. The other thing that's important to note from this, in addition to just the direction that the gap is moving in these different periods of time, is to understand the reasons why the gap is moving, or what's, pushing that change. And so for that, shaded regions, the darker blue represents how much of the change is explained by factors we observe. So before, when I showed you the difference between the unadjusted and the adjusted gaps, that's that blue portion of it. This is education, experience, region of the country, and metropolitan status. So that, the lighter blue shows you the observable portion. I apologize, got that reversed. The darker blue is actually showing the unobserved portion, or the portion that we don't explain by education, experience, describing as discrimination, or growing overall wage inequality. It captures both of those trends in that segment. But I will say that the majority of that unobservable the discrimination. So what comes out of this is that in these periods where we've seen significant change in the gap, it's disproportionately being driven by changes in the impact of discrimination on the wages of African Americans relative to whites. And I'll just show one more. Again, this is, look, the previous graph was for new entrant men, again, men with 0 to 10 years of experience. This graph is for new entrant women. I showed this, one, again, to drive home the point that there is not a single Black experience in terms of the trends in this wage gap, but also to point out some things that are unique among women over these distinct periods of time. For one, we see that the expansion of the gap that began in the early 80s continues through the mid-1990s for women. I think you can see that when I showed the race on that graph, where we begin to see the racial gap widening even as the gender component was narrowing. But the other thing I think that's unique about this graph is that we have this period here where most of that change is being explained by things we observe. So education, experience, region, et cetera. And in fact, points of the total 6.3% growth in the gap has to do with a growing education gap. But not in the way that you may think of an education gap growing, because in this period, educational attainment is increasing for African as well. It's just that the rate for white women is increasing much faster than the rate for Black women. So we get this growing educational gap that's expanding wage gaps, even though Black women are increasing educational attainment. So that's sort of an interesting finding there. And then, large narrowing of the gap, mainly driven by those unobservable factors, discrimination, lessening any post-Great Recession. The largest expansion of racial wage gaps has actually been among this group of younger new entrant African American women. So now that I've given you a strong, healthy dose of, I'm going to turn things over to my co-author, Bill Rodgers, who can hopefully buffer some of this bad news with some recommendations of what we think can be done. So the news isn't great, but there are ways to address it. Over to Bill for that.
Oh, it's that one. Okay. The one with the noise coming out of the mouth. Okay. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Hello. Hello. Valerie, for your friendship and your colleagueship, and for doing and presenting the analysis. This is going to be one of these papers, at least for me, and I'll pick it up a week. A tidbit out, something I learned, or just there's so much information in it that even a month from now, we'll be continuing to digest these results and what they mean. What I want to do is take a few minutes, some of our initial sort of muses of kind of what we think needs to be done, and building on Valerie's statement that the African American experience is not some. There's so much heterogeneity in the experiences now that means there's no silver bullet. There's no silver bullet to solutions. What you're going to suggest for young high school graduates is going to be very different probably from what you're going to suggest for college graduates, or an earlier work that Richard and I had done, where that it was the sort of experience of older workers would insulate the African American older workers, would insulate them from from some of the economic from discrimination, from barriers. But in this, one of the things that jumps out for me in this analysis is that even the older workers are also doing, have fared poorly, have seen their experiences deteriorate. Back, but one of the, and I'm going to try to preempt it, but one of the things that's frustrating about some of these kinds of papers is they'll be long on the analysis, and then you'll be like, okay, this is what we think we should do, and it's like several pages. We will do a deeper dive on the solutions. That this is sort of this is the update to work that Richard and I have done, and his colleague John Bound have done, and now we've set the table for us, and let's now have that deeper dive in terms of public policy issues. Sector and nonprofits can and should be working together to address these matters of income inequality. And that leads me to the other point that drives a lot of our work is our recommendation in the two areas, what we would call race neutral, and then race specific, right? Types of solutions. So the recommendations around the EEOC developing measures of discrimination at a metro, including a reapplication of the EEO survey that the Department of Labor had put into the field back in the late 1990s and 2000, where we were actually collecting wage and promotion and hiring data from federal contractors. That would be a really of resources. Another good use of resources, we think, is to address this issue that the current population survey, it's pretty good in terms of having measures of educational attainment, but many of you will react, well, that unobservable term is not just discrimination. Maybe and I got some feedback a couple days ago from a colleague who said that wage growth that you're seeing amongst college graduates, are you able to take into account STEM type of courses of study in college versus doing human resources? And if you look at those college salary data, there are tremendous differences, right, in pay. And so some of that growth in the college education gap could be due to that are not captured in the CPS. So, I work on a technical advisory committee with the BLS, and one of the conversations I will have with the commissioner and some of my colleagues is because they're always looking to improve their data products that we improve our measures of these unobservables. So, and would that be in the Education October supplement, or is it something that would be worthy enough to be put into the basic CPS? An example of it being cleaning up the data, and it's not, if you dare I say this, but sexy, but how we measure things are so important. Right? Measurement is so important. I think another area that I would like us to pursue, and it's been a conversation that's been going on for probably over a year now, and that is whether the Federal Reserve is going to begin to raise interest rates. The idea here is that some work Federal Reserve economists that Seth Carpenter and I did a couple years ago, we found that when the Fed pursues contractionary monetary policy, you actually do see that African Americans and certain industries increases or to contractionary monetary policy. And why do I say this? Why is this important? Well, some of the work that Richard and I did, and I think we're thinking about doing the third version of it. we have a third expansion, but we showed in the 1990s that you needed 4 to 5 years, or 2 to 3 years of extremely low unemployment rate, unemployment down to the 3 and the 4% range, before young, less educated African American men and young men and young workers in general began to really see the benefits via employment and wages. So if you look at the current sort of evidence that's about the economy, and you link that to the language that the Fed is talking about, where they feel we should be raising, that's in their realm. I focus on the real unemployment rate, we like to say, instead of the official, where that includes those who are working part-time but want to work full-time. Job they take it, that jobless rate is still close to 10%. Right? So there still is an incredible amount of labor slack in the market. So beginning to raise rates would start to slow down the economy. Of borrowing is more expensive. And then there are a variety of recommendations. I'm not going to go through them specifically, but there are a variety of recommendations that remind me of when I was. It was about trying to make the workplace fair. Make the workplace fair, and many of these are now in that bucket where I would call being more race neutral. Okay, that if we can make the economy fairer in terms of workers having rights, in terms of their ability to negotiate, in terms of being able to know what other people are being paid in the work, their colleagues are being paid, that will go also, I think, a distance in terms of being help out and help that Valerie has shown. And this is the challenge because a portion of this growth in inequality, it is race specific, but it's also just because, as we started the conversation off with, that all Americans are both. And then I'll just conclude with with some things that I'm doing in my kind of personal research, but also I would link it to some advocacy work that are all types of activities. But the piece of research that I've been focusing on is the United Nations has this wonderful phrase called human priority investments. And what's great about this concept is that it includes, it's but it also focuses on something that Glenn Loury taught us early on in his career about social capital. And what I've found is that when you look at human priority investment in the U.S., going back, we've slowed down our investment in human priorities and these human capital and social capital investments. 1980s and the period from 2001 to 2007. Okay. Also, two key periods in black-white inequality. Okay. We are on the precipice, or we've been sowing the seeds for a third surge in income inequality, and hence probably a growth in black-white inequality. If you look over the last few years, if you look at and hence the cuts and slowdown in investments in education, training, in communities, low trend or below what you would predict we would be at. And then my final point would be is that the way I think about this, the policy choice, or the things that we can be doing to address income inequality, it really comes down to, and then it's in broader income inequality, 1980s style of economic growth, or do we want a 1990s style of economic growth? What differentiates the two? It's the role of institutions, the role of policy. So, thank you.
Valerie, for those presentations. I want to just, before we bring in Richard and Dorian, I just wanted to drill down on the issue of discrimination and the unobservables. I wrote a piece about workplace discrimination a couple of months ago at the federal level, which showed that the EEOC throws out about 3/4 of the workplace discrimination cases that they get because it's so difficult to prove discrimination. And it would appear that you guys have in some way quantified when it comes to pay. The unobservables, can we assume that those things are, you have the wrong name, you went to the wrong school? I mean, are those some of the things that, I know you suggested we should do more research into finding what it means, when we say discrimination. So what are those types of things that you're seeing?
So we don't make an attempt in the paper to define or identify what discrimination is. I think it can include the ones that you've mentioned. What we're basically saying is that, okay, once we've controlled for all of the factors that are available and are measured and would reasonably impact a person's wages, we still have Black and white workers. As Bill mentioned, there may be other variables that aren't measured or captured that we could plug in here. We tried some additional things in the paper that I didn't share in the presentation this morning. An industry concentration of workers. We factored in the impact of declining unionization. We looked within certain industries, and none of those things. There may be other observable things that could be included that would maybe narrow it some, but I'm still convinced that there's a sizable portion of the gap that is attributable to discrimination, and characteristics, and the difference by race is significant enough that a significant portion of that I think can be described as discrimination.
And what struck me most about the report was there, regardless of experience, regardless of education, there was still a gap when you looked at people, who had 11 plus years experience, up to 10 years experience, had advanced degrees. So I think that does tell us that.
Can I
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, one of the I'm on. One of the pieces of evidence that I found also very compelling that it says with this current population base that a good chunk of what we're seeing or measure or potentially measuring is related to discrimination is look at the regional chart where Western workers and Richard and John initially captured this in their first version of the piece that they published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics. And young, less educated Midwestern Black men were pretty much close to parity back in the. By the end of the decade, they were now experiencing similar wage gaps to what we see in the South, what we see in the West, right? Why is that? Well, we know that unionization during that period of time, you had President Reagan basically attacking or going at the pilots union. That's right. Yeah. Air traffic controller. And so the beginning of really, or beginning depending upon your your view, but the erosion in manufacturing, largely the Midwest, and so you had institutions and you had a labor demand that was helping men, right? While you had a national overlay of sort of drilling at and going after organized labor. You also had but you didn't have an increase in the minimum wage. Right. So back to my opening comments, the theme here is that, institutions matter. Right? The institutions matter, and they change in a way that, right, in economist terms, right, basically made it less costly to discriminate, right, or to use race in deciding pay outcomes. So.
Richard, you've been doing this work for decades. This paper came out. Was it surprise, dismay, expectations met?
Oh, it was very depressing, because unfortunately, so one of my first papers was right after the Civil Rights Act was passed. And at that point, you saw these differentials declining sharply. And then in this, the most depressing were the groups that really had, the differentials had become small, have now widened. So it was that the people who got to, it's not quite equality, but close enough, family connections, there's a whole bunch of little things that you could imagine doing it. And that's the young men and women who, the college graduates, women in general, was close to white women. As Bill said, in the Midwest. And so you had a group of things you'd said, okay, the policy, the basic policy of you can't discriminate, there's some affirmative activity, that works. To me is the most depressing phenomenon. And Bill sort of touched on that in the sense of when you start looking for policies, a much harder kind of thing. You know, it's as if we found a way to stop some cancers, and then 3 years later they're regrowing, and that's a very tough, I think, issue.
How much would you say is enforcement of affirmative action? Is it, just these unobservable,
I mean, the reality is, I don't know. We need some of the data and analyses that Bill was talking about to illuminate that. In my head, what fraction would be there? Until recently, I assumed that the discriminatory attitudes of whites certainly didn't get. We don't see that. They've always been there, and they're always going to be, they are there. And we know from name things and so on, that's a certain fraction. But we're talking now about a wide worse. And I find that hard to believe in the way modern society operates. So we may not have eliminated, got it down more. And this is a worsening, and that's, again, the depressing. I'll a few other suggestions to add to both the policy and the analysis.
I want to throw this out to the panel, all the folks on the panel. There's been a lot of talk in this election season about the sort of would suggest that blacks are still paid less than their white counterparts. Have we, in the media, been missing this conversation? Has there been an over and not enough focus on these sorts of economic issues that are affecting Black Americans in particular, but I would imagine they also extend to Black and other minority Latinos, for example.
Now it's my turn on
Given,
that question. Okay.
yes, and now it's your
Sure,
turn.
I'll give it a shot.
The conversation's really begun now.
So the way I think about this is from Canary, which argues that if you want to know the health of American democracy, all you have to do is look at the plight of Black people and go institution through institution, whether it's voting rights or health. I know from that parable, the miner's canary, miners would take a canary into the coal mines with them because their lungs were so tiny that if there were toxic gases, when the canary died, the miners knew to get out. In our democracy, you can make the same argument around the labor market. And so it's not surprising to me all the data in this paper around what's happened to Black workers and as well as the gender democracy of the labor market. Look at Black women in particular, and we'll understand what's potentially happening to everybody. So the wage disparities we see, the wage stagnation we see, happening to black workers over this time, it's not surprising that they've happened to all workers. It's white people too, in a sense. So none of the paper is, and Valerie and Bill are to be commended on this incredible work. It's depressing, but it's not surprising, unfortunately, that what we're seeing that's occurred with black workers has also occurred with others.
And the movement,
excuse me,
yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
And one of the reasons why we chose the technique that we used, called this wage decomposition, that it allows us to distinguish between which we attribute to discrimination or other things that we are not able to measure, but they differ by race, and the portion that we believe is due to just the fact that, right, wage inequality. And then point two is that the sort of typical median or mean black wage is, let's say, at the 35th or 40 percentile of the white distribution. And so what that means then is that as overall income inequality worsened, right, worsened, it had a greater effect, and it helped to create or expand the black-white wage gap because a larger percentage or a larger share of African Americans, right, and so we're able to give you a sort of an estimate of how much is due to just this general phenomena, right, of growing income inequality, of wages stagnating, versus how much of it is race specific.
Last night we saw the, wonder if anyone on the panel has any thoughts about whether or not this issue was addressed at all. I know there was a little bit of criticism about the lack of focus on poverty, like I like to call it the race question that comes up in every debate. Given these numbers and given what you all heard last night, where do you think there needs to be more focus on poverty and wage growth, where the candidates addressing it last had an actual plan?
I wouldn't even go to plan. I would just start off with just conceptualizing and thinking about the problem. Secretary Clinton, I think, falls into it. One of the key messages in this paper, and that I made in my version for my dissertation, and Richard and John made in their version, and I led off with my comments here, is that, right, it's spoken of the African American community, right? It's African Americans, and if you want to be even more precise, it's African Americans and the communities in which they live. Right? To me, that's I think that's the starting point we have to and I'm not going to mention who, but have to do a better job of, right, thinking about the framework in which you're discussing. The other piece is Hugh Price, former president of the National Urban League. He said something wonderful right when he was, or it's half full, and that we know what we need to do. I mean, along with what we listed up here, there are other things we know what we need to do. It's coming. It comes back to what's the political will, and then also the reframing that instead, I think, are guilty of the following. Instead of framing the conversation as a conversation around, can we afford it? I put my old school board member hat on. Build a budget of need first, and then figure out how you're going to fund it.
Can I say something there? So my impression of last night's debate, and often when we hear issues of race come up in political conversation, is that often the emphasis on social injustice, social inequality side of it. And that's definitely important. I understand why that gets more attention because, everyone has a cell phone camera now. the proliferation of social media. These are things that are easy to capture in an image and to put on television. That, yeah, that's clearly unfair, that's racist, that's biased. I think we tend to get less substantive conversation about the economic inequality, economic injustice, because of what I like to say, it's not really a equality. The kind of research that we do here. That's a good idea, though. The research that, economists do, sociologists do, is essentially the body camera for economic inequality, because we don't, we can't capture fine details and things that you have to sort of pin things down and then say, okay, all of the reasons that you would give for why there should be an economic disparity here, we've held all those things constant, and we're still looking at a 20%. What else could it be here? The only other thing that all these workers have in common, well, not the only other thing, but the biggest factor that these workers still have in common is race. So that clearly is a factor, and I think that on economic inequality as it relates to the role of race, because it is something that's harder to see or prove or even know when we talk about the availability of data and information on just, what other people are being paid and jobs.
But Valerie, then why to accept that the pay differences we see between men and women, that's discrimination?
Yeah, and that's another part of the conversation. I think that's another important question that we started out with here. Why does that get more play than the racial?
That's discrimination.
That's discrimination, right? Because I think there is, we go back to attitudes and biases. I think there is some assumption that Black workers shouldn't be paid as much. They aren't as highly qualified, aren't as capable.
For a minute, what I thought was missing in the race question was any mention of Black Lives Matter, particularly today, on gun control and all of these other, which not even sure that should have been part of that conversation. But the movement for Black lives has evolved from when I was on the ground in Ferguson to today. There is a plan. There are policy expectations. The economic justice portion of the movement for Black Lives policy agenda. I'm curious if you can tell us a little bit about what some of those points are.
Could I answer the previous question first? Because, and I don't want to talk about the debate all day, but debate formats, both on the Republican side, well, in the Donald Trump sense, it's just Black people are criminals and we need law and order. But even in the Democratic primaries, if you notice when race came up, whether it was Bernie Sanders or Hillary Clinton, it was still about Black people and from the discussion, right? It's either they're criminals and need to be locked up, or we need to deal with mass incarceration, and Black workers disappear. And what didn't come up were questions around, this is to Bill's point about how institutions matter. So if we take the EEOC, for instance, the trend we saw of the declining racial wage gap ends around 1980, and two things happen in the 80s. Reagan's president, he appoints a conservative group of folks at the EEOC, including Clarence Thomas, who then retreat from enforcing the Civil Rights Act of 30 years of Supreme Court appointments. The court is now, right, there's a conservative majority in the court, which has attacked remedies using the Civil Rights Act, right, in Title VII in particular, around employment discrimination, including, by the way, around gender. If you think of the and said, no, even though there are 1.2 million women that can show a disparate impact of discrimination, you can't prove it. So I think we need part of what, and I'll come to the Movement for Black Lives policy platform, but even there, and I think all of us are using a mid-20th century range of tools to combat employment discrimination. And we need to reimagine what are the tools in the 21st century. And what I mean by that is, I was sort of joking about the body cameras, but not really, because and what you're showing with the unobservables, we actually do have observational data in a sense. We have field experiments, right? So we have audit studies or field experiments. We send testers in the field, whites and blacks, white men, black men, white women, black women, actually prove discrimination. And it usually takes place in one of three ways. One, there's just in the first initial hiring process. Who gets a call back, who doesn't? Who gets an interview, who doesn't? Who gets a job offer, who doesn't? Secondly is something called job channeling. So jobs are back of the house jobs, if you work at a restaurant or a hotel, for instance. And then last, the third mechanism arguably is, do you get the same wages for the same job description? If we could put body cameras on workers, action in some way, right? I mean but nonetheless, we have the experimental data, the field experiments that really shows, and I think even more so than survey data, how discrimination occurs today. But we don't have processes of discrimination. Let me say just a quick word on the movement for Black Lives. Social movements in this country historically do two things. They put issues on the agenda that wouldn't be in the agenda, and they create the political will for new policy enactment. And it's doing it beyond just police and state violence and vigilante violence. There is a robust economic agenda, including, I think, everything that you put up, the right to organize and collectively bargain. So another example that we need to update for the 21st century. If you think of federal state jobs programs, guaranteed living wage, all of these things are in the policy platform of the Movement for Black Lives. That's a very robust economic agenda that I think
In order for something to gain political will, given the sort of political conversation I mentioned earlier around working class whites, do policy initiatives have to benefit, will they not get the political support if they're race specific? Richard.
Yeah. The first chart that Valerie put up, which was the productivity gain, and then the incomes, the share of the national income that goes to workers has been falling. So now you're thinking of workers, black, white, men, women, smaller and smaller, larger share going to the people who own capital. And if they do badly in the wage and things, they do worse in terms of ownership of capital. So it's even more uneven there. But if you take that number, it was like 60%. And the thought experiment to me was race neutral policy, whereby everybody had risen their wages, wages rose by 60%, versus a policy that had reduced the black-white difference by 5%, which would have run down people much better off than the 5%. So I think one of the themes I took from the report and that starting comment was the first biggest thing is to get everybody, and then if whatever we can do special to close the gaps. But what has harmed the living standards of everybody has been the fact that the wages haven't kept pace with productivity. Cutting of the race differences that would benefit a black worker as much as having had a growth of wages at the same rate as productivity. That's 60%. So that you have a very sharp, I think, thing that came from this report I read. That first chart, which just said the first order of priority has to be to deal with the broad problem of workers not getting the inequality among workers, as Bill pointed out. If you're in the 35th or 40th percentile, you don't need any extra race discrimination issues. You just fall behind the people people of other ethnicities who are in the 35th. Everybody in the 35th suffers. So that's the way I read that evidence and the report.
And I wanted to, when we're speaking about race-specific policies, I think, not to get too far away from now, since Ta-Nehisi Coates, wrote about the case for reparations, we've been having this conversation now. Is that, Dorian, you've spoken about that. Is that even something that can become a realistic part of this? If we're recently talked about, they're resistant often to workplace diversity programs. I can't imagine reparations gaining much steam. You have to look at the data or look at paid data. How do we even begin to get political will for something like reparations?
That question. The idea that we didn't think we could create political will for, or progressive taxation, or direct election of senators, or there are a range of issues that seemed impossible that then became possible. The platform, one of the calls is for the Conyers bill he's introduced for the last, 40 years, to even study the idea, which seems harmless to me, right? Just the study, that's what we do. There are a couple, my take on this is, it's interesting to me, number one, we don't have as much of a hang-up around gender-conscious or gender-neutral policies as we do around race-conscious versus race-neutral policies. I tend to think it's an old improv. We need race-neutral policies. On the one hand, increasing worker bargaining power, that's race-neutral. It would help Black workers tremendously. We know that. The data is clear on that. But on the other hand, just like trickle-down economics doesn't help most workers, I don't think trickle-down workers. And I think in some cases, and then I think this varies by geography as well, we might need a targeted policy approach in the Midwest that's different from the South, that's different from Silicon Valley, that's different from DC or the East Coast. So not saying everything should be race neutral or everything should be race conscious, but where does it, right? What are the conditions in a particular place, and what are the remedies required to address the racial wage gaps, to address the gender wage gaps, and especially both the racial and gender wage gaps? I think of, the old saying, if all you have in your toolbox is the hammer, everything looks like a nail. I don't think that's going to address the gender and racial wage gaps if we're just using the same flat policy. So I think in particular places, what remedies do we need to address certain labor market patterns in the Midwest, in the South, et cetera?
We're heading into, in the next couple of decades, people of color will be the majority of people in this country. Collectively, there will be more women of color than white women in this country. What impact does this have? If this continues, what impact will this have nationally?
I think when we look at the trends in growing inequality, particularly when we consider that women of color tend to be on the lowest end of the totem pole when we look at these inequalities, and given some of the facts that you just mentioned, it's a problem for women. It's no longer just a problem for people of color. Women overall are about half of the population. So even if we're not adding on the additional disadvantage, if half of the population is being underpaid, that has surely an impact on the overall health of our economy. I think too often we talk about these issues as if, oh, that's a women's issue, that's Latinos, without the realization that we all make up America and are all a part of the American economy. To me, is just common sense out of everybody in this country.
Yeah, I think I agree with Valerie that and I'll go even, I think, a little further, that this has implications for our competitiveness, as a nation. Our, uh, that these pay gaps, and if a good chunk of them are due to discrimination, there are emotional that impact individuals, impact communities. So, which then leads to lower productivity. And then if you take, that's the race specific. In Jersey, I'm doing some work with. I'm a volunteer board member on one of our regional United Ways, and we've been doing work on what we call ALICE, where ALICE stands for Asset Limited, Income Constrained, and Employed. And basically, it's another way of thinking about where they are at or below this ALICE threshold, where they cannot afford, or they don't have the resources to be able to sort of have this basic standard of living to what it costs to live in their county, and a disproportionate them are also are white, Latino, Asian. And what that means is, if we don't again address the issue around our lower wages and the stagnating wages, and that break between productivity and it will feed into, again, lower productivity growth, which feeds into economic growth. Right? That we're seeing, and we've been seeing and experiencing this recovery has been long and expansive, but the GDP growth, and we can quibble about how proxy, has been very tepid at best. So, so the challenge is, I think, really coming back to something I said earlier, is and for me, it's really buttressed by this work on ALICE that we're doing. We talk about how these low wages or the challenges that these households face. What's the impact on the household itself? But we also then talk about how this affects the community. How does this affect the state? And so we also need to do a better job as researchers and policy analysts, is make sure that we're really connecting the dots for people, and taking these what appear to be, this just affects one group, one that connects to to economic growth. Right? And then, as I said, if you have half of your population or half of your workforce that is getting paid less for doing time, that erodes confidence. That has psychological effects, and hence will impact our ability to compete.
And a lot of, just to sort of bring it full circle, and then I want to open it up to the audience. When we look at some of the high-profile shootings and killings that we've seen over the past 2 years at least, we know that in no city that any of these has taken place likely to be employed than whites. So whites are consistently, actually we're coming out with a chart later on today where I look at, on CNN Money, where we look at the last 5 cities, so Charlotte, we look at Tulsa, and we look at Milwaukee, and sort of explain ratios are, and then what the employment ratios are comparing whites to blacks. And whites consistently make double and have half the rate of unemployment that blacks do. So there's something happening nationally at this level, and we're seeing it particularly in class black communities, right? These shootings are not living in an economic free bubble, right? Would you agree? Yeah. So I want to have one right here, and then we'll get to you. Go ahead.
So I wanted to, I'm so sorry. I'm a loud talker. So I wanted to. Who are you? I'm sorry. Thank you, Dorian. Nikki Dickerson von Lockett, Penn State University. Relations department, and so I've been looking at work and workers. And so I wanted to bring a sociological view to some of the analyses, so the discrimination piece. So just taught on this in my race and gender employment class this week about thinking bias the way we've traditionally thought about it versus what academics call typically institutional discrimination, which I think we can think, which we're broadening the idea of thinking about not just discrimination, but thinking about exclusion and advantage or disadvantage. So I say that whereas so the audit studies that Dorian talked about, and a lot of the things that Tanzina, that you've brought up in terms of what happens in workplaces, so that's one piece of the puzzle, and that's showing up in some of the analyses. But is occurring before we get to workplaces, right? People have so when we still have these wide disparities in unemployment, right? That issues around, so for example, word of mouth recruiting. This is right. These are race neutral. I always say and I always practice, it has no intention to discriminate. It's to reduce cost. Economists think about this as incentives for organizations, right? There's an incentive to make money, not an incentive to discriminate. But those incentives oftentimes can disadvantage or exclude women, minorities. Think about those, and I love the body cam. I love the body cam for not just the workplace, but for the labor market. So I want to widen some of these to think about. Bill talked about social capital. We also use this idea of social networks, right? That workers share information about job openings. Private employers don't have. And so, but they often, that information is shared among social networks. Social networks are segregated by race, ethnicity, by space, where we live. So I wanted to bring some of those things to discussion.
I think that's a critical thing that you're bringing up. I mean, I feel like the conversation, at least as it relates to media, is something that I'm constantly talking about, the lack of diversity and inclusion in media. To your point, I think, and I've written about these issues, culture fit is a big reason why, if often people tend to hire people who look like them, went to the same schools as they did. Is this whole conversation we're having about implicit bias and unconscious bias. Power structures tend to replicate themselves, right? So often when you have, and you see this a lot in media, and I'm sure, in other industries as well, but we've seen it quite a bit in media. People leave from one outlet, the hierarchy will sort of move, and then they'll bring the second in command, the third in command. So they replicate power structures at the very highest levels, which then makes it difficult to penetrate. Because if I, let's say, worked at CBS, and I'm not saying, I've not worked for either of those places, and I bring all my former CBS folks with me, it's going to have that difficult, if you haven't gotten in that group, it's going to be difficult to penetrate. And the third thing I think happens is something I call assignment equity. Once you're in the door, I think a lot of media organizations stop there, and I'm sure a lot of other organizations stop there. What types of assignments are we giving different people of color? What are the assignments the women are getting? What are the assignments, journalists of color? I ask all the time, who the science reporters, the business reporters, not just Metro, which is great, but I was a Metro reporter myself, but how much, assignment equity are we seeing across the board? So to your point.
Yeah, but the question there, because I think it's nailed something absolutely correct. It's the connections that people have. And then what's the policy that we can do for this? I actually don't think the government's going to be too much involved. It has to be through the communities. And I know in the area of the college graduates, and particularly PhD students, and so on, you are connected by your supervisor and other people. Yep. And if you're a minority person or a woman, you may have weaker connections and links. And we know that actually both of them, one through money and one through presidency. that certainly furthered their career. So what do you do to do this? You need, I would think, perhaps Black Lives Matter, maybe. You need people to have mentors outside of their. We do have some programs for underrepresented undergraduates to get some mentoring from faculty more connected, who then can help the people's careers. The policy there, it's hard to see what a government maybe could give money for some programs in that area. So just connect people up, and the earlier you connect them, I think the more beneficial the whole thing operates. Like one other comment on the correct, and if it's not a question of the people who are incarcerated, it's that a lot of young Black men will come with a bit of a criminal record, and that just kills off their job chances. The data that them off the same way it does whites. So it's not that the employers already are against the Black, not as favorable to the Black workers in the audits. But if they come in, it'll reduce their chances by 1/2 of getting a call back. The same reduction it does among whites. So they're sort of applying the same. It has to matter. Something where you say, no, the person, yes, committed a crime when he was a young jerk, if I can phrase it that way. He's now, I don't know, 25, 30 years old. Doesn't affect Black women at all. This is a men thing. And now they've got some done this historically saying this guy's a good guy. But maybe we need a stronger program, or some, be it public or private, to have these people connected in a way. So if I say, this young man here is a good guy, blah, 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 and I'm putting my reputation on the young person, because he's not going to want to be destructive to whoever is attesting for him, and gets people this link. Because without getting those links, the family background stuff is just going to keep people from improving the way they should and getting the kinds of jobs.
Policy for people with criminal records, the ban the box legislation that's sort of making its way around the country. There are some cities that have signed on to not ask the incarceration question until, I believe, there's been an offer of employment made. So there's some things that can be done, but again, in Harvard, how these diversity initiatives don't work, there's a lot of resistance to them internally and organizationally, and often people feel forced. They don't want to feel like they have to, hire outside of the culture fit. So that presents a more subtle, but I think different.
Want to hire outside his group if I'm saying it's a he, probably, the white man. If he is a mentor to somebody else, suddenly that person becomes part of his group. It is much harder to say no when you're a person out there that's trying to force me to hire, as opposed to somebody I know. And this occurs among college alumni. It occurs in the Black community. The alumni from the historically Black colleges favor. So it's a human trait you want to somehow use in a positive way to open doors instead of to close doors.
Yeah. I mean, the American Economic Association, for I guess we're now on probably into close to 40 years, has run a mentoring program. The folks who were directing it and the AA, I remember, got nervous because when some of the college admissions around race and diversity were challenged, there was no direct challenge to this small little program that goes to a university each summer and brings in, depending upon the budget, 20 to 30 kids. They got worried about having a lawsuit. So here's an example again where institutions matter, and you don't even have to have a formal, formal lawsuit or formal infraction. Got very nervous. I love what Nikki said about the networks, but that's one of the things that I've been doing, have done, is also been trying to, because basically with these the young men that Richard's talking about, in the response, there is this desire, like, I don't want to hire them. Right? So one of the things that I did at the College of William and Mary before I left, and now I'm working with the Institute for Social Justice on a project, on a workforce project in Newark, is we're trying to show, so at William and Mary I showed that when you're paying your landscapers and housekeepers, right, $7 an hour, $6 an hour for, in some cases, for decades, for employees who have low morale, who are unhealthy, and hence, right, you're not getting the productivity, the effort from these people is not great. And that when you raise those wages and improve those to success, we built a business case. We showed that in the occupations that we were paying below market, those had the highest turnover rates. Those had the greatest sort of attrition, and the employer, the administrators, they got that. We project there. I'm trying to get some of our anchor companies to allow us to do a similar kind of analysis, but we're also trying to build this case of and it gets back to something you asked earlier, where you started giving the demography of these various groups. Right? I have has potentially a buying power of about $4.2 billion. It's probably half that because their unemployment rates are much higher. I'm trying to figure out how to weight it, but I want to take that $4.2 billion and say that's potentially what you could do, and then link to right? Or I'm able to break out that 4.2 into different types of commodities. Right? And so if universities see that a good chunk of that buying power is in education, you now have people on their platform. So it's not something it would be something to complement what Nikki was saying. Because I do agree that it is about I've over my career, I've come to a way, I don't use mentor anymore. I use advocates. That people need advocates. Right.
I'm a sociologist. I wrote the book Sundown Towns about the most egregious ongoing discrimination we still have, perhaps. I have a question for Ms. Wilson. It's straight out of the paper. Figure N, if you want to look at it, maybe. Your unobservables and your observables, and that's very interesting. But I wish you'd walk me through a little bit on Figure N, because on Figure N, almost throughout the figure, certainly the last three bars especially, the observable are behaving in one way, and the unobservables are behaving in the opposite way. And if you could just walk me through that, then I'd understand it better, and I bet I'm not the only person with this problem.
So again, that's similar to the graphs that I showed you earlier that had, and sort of see the visual of what we're talking about. And even in this case, there's one where you see observables on the top. So what the overall bar is measuring is the change in the gap. Okay, so the gap can expand even if the factors that contribute to your wages aren't necessarily moving in the same direction. So you could have done things that would have narrowed the gap, education being one of the best examples. There are periods when the education gap is narrowing. That would have served to narrow the measured wage gap if it were not for these other factors working against that. So in many cases, in different periods of time, we see that this unobservable or discrimination, growing inequality portion of it actually erasing any gains that people would have made by their own efforts of increasing education or other things like that. So see like the two directions, that's a factor of that, these other factors are just having a much larger impact on wages than what people individually could do.
Thanks, that helps. But my particular question is with the furthest right thing on figure N, in which the unobservables are decreasing, it looks to me like they're decreasing the gap, while the observables are increasing the gap. So that would be kind of the opposite of what you just said. Somehow something bad is happening in education or some other of your observables, while meanwhile, let's say straight racism, if that's the most important unobservable, seems to be decreasing.
Right.
Would that be right?
So again, just so everyone knows what we're talking about, this figure that he's looking at is for experienced men. So this is the group that would be this older group. Bill mentioned that, some of the things that we see over time is that, gaps have widened for this group as well, but to some extent, they're from some of the broader macroeconomic shifts. The other thing that I would point out on this graph is that the overall change is really small. So essentially, in this period, because it's 2007 to 2015, like that negative 0.3 is essentially no change. So in that instance, we don't really see like a measured difference in the wage gap. That's an insignificant, statistically insignificant change in maybe moving in opposite directions. But the way that we would measure or identify the change that happened in that period was essentially that the gap was pretty flat. So those factors are sort of completely wiping each other out. Yeah.
I think we have time for one more quick question, right here in the front.
I have a question. I have a question for Mr. Rodgers. If I read your statement ago, the South had this huge gap against the rest of the country, including a huge racial wage gap. Basically, the South has stayed flat and everybody else has declined. Would that be and come down to that level? God forbid. Was that?
I think that's the correct statement. Before we started, Richard, Larry, and I, and Valerie were talking about how that instead of labor policy that was, let's say, in the Midwest, dominating, right, and sort of helping to either keep wages up or draw wages up in the South, right, that I think we concluded, and they can speak for themselves, but I took from our conversation that in actuality what's happened over time is probably the labor policies have spread to these other high wage regions. Richard jumped in and cited Wisconsin, right, as being an example of a state that had been viewed as being pretty progressive, but clearly, has.
How do we change that?
Well, I think it's a combination of all the thoughts that have been raised. Nikki's getting us to on social networks and how within workplaces people advocate for each other and support each other, and what Dorian was bringing up in terms of some of the issues race neutral, right? So that, and seeing how Black Lives Matter, as what you were saying, that they've expanded that conversation. And then I think also, topping it off with some of the things that Valerie and I, have suggested, and I know Richard did in my profit sharing, right? Some of your work you've done, and then Tanzina, she's mentioned, and so I think this, as I shared at the beginning of my formal remarks, was that this is the first paper to kind of lay out the new dimensions of what the gaps are, and that the next work, Larry in the back, next work should be a bigger piece, right? That really, integrates all these ideas and others together. So, for the next president.
And we'll see who that's going to be in a couple of weeks. Thank you to our panel, to Valerie, for this, and thank you for being here.